The white silk of my gown felt like armor, but the air in the ballroom had turned frigid. While the orchestra played a soft, deceptive waltz, Julian leaned in close, smelling of expensive bourbon and unearned arrogance, to whisper the words that ended my career and started his father's downfall. The champagne in my glass was a vintage Krug, the kind that costs more than a modest car. Yet it tasted like liquid iron as Julian spoke. The crystal fluted glass caught the light of the massive chandeliers, scattering fractured diamonds across the table where my bouquet lay, peonies and white roses, now looking like funeral arrangements for a life I had spent 7 years building. Julian, the CEO's son, and a man whose only talent was inheriting a surname, didn't even have the decency to wait until the cake was cut. He stood there in his bespoke tuxedo, looking every bit the prince of industry, while his eyes gleamed with the predatory satisfaction of a small man finally holding a big stick. "My father was going to get rid of you anyway," he repeated, his smirk deepening until it became a physical weight against my chest. "You were just a placeholder, Elena. A very efficient, very expensive placeholder. But now, the wedding is a nice touch, a clean break." I looked past him to where his father, Arthur Sterling, was holding court near the fireplace. Arthur hadn't looked at me once since the ceremony. For years, I had been his right hand, the ghostwriter of his legacy, the woman who turned a failing brokerage into a $44 million powerhouse. I had sacrificed sleep, relationships, and sanity for Sterling Global. And here was his spawn, informing me between sips of bubbly that I was being discarded like yesterday's spreadsheet. The irony was as sharp as the lace against my skin. I had spent months planning this day, believing I had finally earned a moment of peace. Instead, I was staring at the architectural ruin of my career. The ballroom was filled with the elite of the city, people who smiled at me because they feared my influence, people who would stop taking my calls the moment the clock struck midnight and my access was revoked. "Is that so?" I replied, my voice coming out as smooth as the silk of my dress. I felt a strange, cold clarity wash over me. It wasn't the heat of anger, it was the absolute zero of realization. I took a slow sip of the champagne, letting the bubbles prickle against my tongue, and watched Julian's face. He wanted me to cry. He wanted a scene. He wanted the satisfaction of seeing the Ice Queen shatter, but Julian had made a fatal error. He assumed my value was tied to the title on my business card. He forgot that I wasn't just a cog in the Sterling machine. I was the one who had designed the gears. In the corner of my eye, I saw my work phone vibrating on the table, a notification from the Henderson account, the $44 million cornerstone of our firm. The client was demanding a finalized exit report before the Asian markets opened on Monday. They only trusted one person to handle it. I reached out and picked up the phone. Julian's smirk faltered for a second. "Still working on your wedding night? That's why you're being replaced, Elena. You have no life." "You're right, Julian," I said, my thumb hovering over the power button. "I've spent too much time living for Sterling Global." I looked him dead in the eye, a faint, ironic smile touching my lips. "Let's see how the firm lives without me." With a deliberate click, I held the button down. The screen went black. The digital heartbeat of my professional life, the emails, the encrypted chats, the emergency overrides, was silenced. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, replaced by a terrifying, exhilarating lightness. I had the keys to the kingdom in my head, and I had just locked the gates from the outside. Julian laughed, a harsh, grating sound that didn't reach his eyes. "You think turning off a phone changes anything? My father is the CEO. You're just a girl in a white dress who got lucky." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I looked around the room, noting the expensive floral arrangements and the tiered cake that cost 5 figures. It was all a facade, a house of cards built on the data only I knew how to manipulate. Arthur Sterling thought he was pruning a branch. He didn't realize he was cutting the taproot. As the music swelled into a more upbeat tempo, I felt the first true spark of anticipation. The silence of my phone was deafening, but it was nothing compared to the silence that was about to hit the Sterling Global boardroom in 36 hours. The mistake they were making wasn't just a lapse in judgment. It was a mathematical certainty of disaster. Julian walked away, triumphant and oblivious, while I signaled the waiter for another glass. I had a wedding to enjoy, after all. What Julian didn't know was that the $44 million client report wasn't just a document, it was a ticking clock, and I had just taken the batteries out. The ballroom felt like a gilded cage, but for the first time, I held the only key. As I watched Julian disappear into the crowd of socialites, I felt a strange sense of detachment. The scent of expensive lilies and floor wax, which usually signaled a high-stakes corporate gala, now just felt like the backdrop to a very expensive farce. I sat back down at the head table, my bridal train pooling around me like a silver tide, and watched the man I had just married, Mark, laughing with his cousins. Mark didn't know. He knew I was successful, but he didn't know that my brain was currently a flickering terminal of lines of code and proprietary algorithms. He didn't know that by morning, the name Sterling would be synonymous with a sinking ship. I reached for a piece of artisan bread, breaking it slowly. Every movement felt choreographed, cinematic. "You look intense," Mark whispered, leaning over to kiss my temple. "Everything okay?" Julian wasn't being his usual charming self, was he? Julian was being exactly who he is, I replied, giving my husband a reassuring smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. "Just a bit of wedding advice from the boss's son. Don't worry about it. Let's dance." As we moved to the center of the floor, the heavy fabric of my dress swayed with a rhythmic shush-shush against the marble. Over Mark's shoulder, I saw Arthur Sterling finally look my way. He raised his glass, a stiff, formal gesture. It wasn't a toast to my happiness. It was a salute to a soldier he'd just sent to the firing squad. He looked smug. He thought he'd timed it perfectly. Firing me on my wedding day meant I'd be too distracted by domestic bliss to fight back or sabotage the transition. He had no idea that the transition was already a ghost. The Henderson account, the $44 million Leviathan that kept the firm's lights on, wasn't secured by a contract alone. It was secured by a series of rolling, manual overrides that I performed every 48 hours to keep their high-frequency trading subsectors from flagging instability in the Sterling servers. It was a fail-safe I'd built to protect the client from the firm's aging infrastructure. Without my specific, biometric-linked login to the Guardian protocol, the Henderson servers would trigger an automatic exit at the first sign of a volatility spike. And the markets in Tokyo were set to open in exactly 30 hours with a projected 2% swing. I leaned my head on Mark's shoulder, closing my eyes. I could almost see the digital red lights starting to blink in the darkened Sterling offices downtown. The IT department, led by Julian's hand-picked geniuses, wouldn't even know where to look. They thought the Guardian protocol was a standard firewall. They didn't realize it was a tether, and I had just let go of the rope. Around us, the party roared. The laughter grew louder, the music more frantic. To everyone else, this was the social event of the season. To me, it was the quiet before the sonic boom. I felt a flicker of pity for the junior analysts who would be called in on a Sunday morning, desperate to find a ghost in the machine that only I knew how to talk to. "You're very quiet, Elena," Mark murmured, spinning me under his arm. Just taking it all in, I said. It's a lot to lose in one day, don't you think? He laughed, thinking I was joking about my maiden name. You're not losing anything, Mrs. Vance. You're just starting over. You have no idea how right you are, I whispered. As the clock struck midnight, the champagne moment arrived. A towering pyramid of glasses, a literal fountain of excess. Arthur Sterling stood up to give a toast. He spoke of loyalty, new chapters, and the family business. The irony was so thick, I could almost choke on it. He was publicly celebrating my departure, while privately believing he had neutralized me. I looked at Julian, who was currently flirting with a bridesmaid, his chest puffed out as if he'd already moved into my corner office. He looked so certain, so safe. It made me wonder, how long does it take for a $44 million hole to swallow a man whole? I didn't have to wait long to find out. The countdown had already begun, and the silence from my darkened phone was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. Tomorrow, the world would wake up to a wedding announcement. On Monday, they would wake up to a corporate autopsy. The mistake wasn't firing me. The mistake was thinking I was the only thing they were losing. Enjoying the fallout so far? The real chaos is just beginning. If you want to see how Elena navigates the wreckage of her former empire and exactly how Julian reacts when the first $44 million domino falls, keep reading. Follow the story to witness the ultimate corporate takedown. The sun rose on Sunday morning with a deceptive, golden tranquility. Mark was still asleep, the rhythmic rise and fall of his shoulders, a stark contrast to the electric hum vibrating in my veins. I sat on the edge of the plush hotel bed, staring at my work phone. It sat on the nightstand like a dormant grenade, cold, black, and heavy, with the potential to erase a decade of Arthur Sterling's legacy. I didn't turn it on. Instead, I went to the window and looked out at the city skyline. Somewhere in that cluster of glass and steel, the automated systems at Sterling Global were beginning to sweat. In London, the markets had already flickered. In Tokyo, the Guardian Protocol would be looking for my digital handshake. Finding nothing but a void, the system would begin its first phase of defensive liquidation. By noon, the first tremors hit. I knew this because Mark's phone began to chirp incessantly on the dresser. He groaned, reaching for it. Who the hell is calling me on a Sunday, especially today? I watched him from the shadows of the heavy velvet curtains. Maybe it's someone wanting to congratulate us, I said, my voice like silk over gravel. Mark looked at the screen, his brow furrowing. It's Julian. 4 missed calls, and a text from your old assistant, Sarah. She sounds panicked, Elena. She says the Henderson servers are throwing critical, fatal errors, and no one can bypass the admin lock. I walked over to the mirror and began brushing my hair. The silver-backed brush, a wedding gift from Arthur himself. How strange, I murmured. Julian told me last night that I was just a placeholder. Surely a placeholder isn't required to fix a critical, fatal error. The irony was delicious. Julian had spent years complaining about my gatekeeping of the technical architecture. He had convinced his father that my role was purely symbolic, that any Ivy League grad with a laptop could replicate my magic. Now, he was staring into a $44 million abyss, realized that the magic wasn't a trick. It was the entire foundation. Elena, Sarah says the CEO is in the office. On a Sunday, Mark said, sitting up, the gravity of the situation finally piercing through his post-wedding haze. They're asking for your override code. They say the Henderson account is bleeding out. I turned to him, the brush poised in midair. Tell them I'm on my honeymoon. Tell them the phone is off. And Mark, don't answer them again. We have a brunch to attend. The champagne moment of the night before had turned into a hangover of epic proportions for the Sterling family. As we sat in the sun-drenched garden of the hotel, sipping mimosas, I could picture the scene in the boardroom. Arthur, red-faced and sweating, screaming at a line of terrified IT technicians. Julian, frantically typing on a keyboard he didn't understand, his smirk replaced by a mask of pale, sweating terror. They would try to force reset the system. That was the mistake most amateurs made. They didn't realize that the Guardian Protocol was designed to interpret a force reset as a hostile takeover. If they tried to break the door down, the system would simply incinerate the house. Every trade, every margin, every cent of the $44 million would be pulled from the Sterling accounts and returned to the client's original holding, triggering a massive exit penalty that Sterling Global would have to pay out of their own pocket. "You're smiling," Mark noted, watching me over the rim of his glass. "It's a very beautiful, very scary smile." "I'm just thinking about the cost of an education," I replied. "Julian is about to receive a very expensive lesson in human capital." As the afternoon wore on, the silence from my end became a weapon. Every hour that passed without my intervention was another $1.2 million in projected loss. By 5 p.m., the mistake was no longer a glitch. It was a headline. I knew Arthur would be reviewing the preliminary exit report soon. He would see the words, "unauthorized access attempt," and "manual handshake missing." He would see my name, or rather, the absence of it. The silence in the garden was peaceful, but in the Sterling boardroom, the silence would be the kind that precedes a landslide. Arthur Sterling was about to realize that you can fire a woman, but you cannot fire the air she breathes into your company. He had tried to prune the tree, but he had accidentally cut the power lines. The sun began to set, casting long, jagged shadows across the grass. "Should we check the news?" Mark asked tentatively. "No," I said, standing up and smoothing my sundress. "Let's go for a walk. I want to see the city before it realizes the king has fallen." I knew the CEO would be staring at the report in exactly 36 hours from the wedding toast. He would see the $44 million exit. He would see the ruin. And finally, he would understand that the most expensive thing in the world is a woman who has absolutely nothing left to lose. Monday morning arrived not with a roar, but with the cold, sterile light of a high-rise office at 6 a.m. 36 hours had passed since the wedding toast. In the executive suite of Sterling Global, the atmosphere wasn't just tense, it was funereal. I wasn't there to see it, but I could imagine every detail. The half-empty cups of bitter espresso, the discarded ties, and the frantic, hollow eyes of the board members who had been summoned from their beds. Arthur Sterling sat at the head of the mahogany table, looking every bit of his 70 years. Before him lay the client exit report. It was a slim folder, but it carried the weight of a tombstone. "Explain this to me," Arthur said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He wasn't looking at the board. He was looking at Julian, who was trembling so violently that the water in his glass rippled. "Explain how $44 million in managed assets just evaporated into the ether." Julian swallowed hard, his face a ghostly shade of gray. "It wasn't an evaporation, Dad. It was an automated liquidation. The Henderson servers, they didn't recognize our new admin credentials. They flagged the transition as a security breach. By the time we bypassed the primary firewall, the Guardian Protocol had already triggered the return to source clause." "The Guardian Protocol," Arthur repeated, the words tasting like ash. "The one Elena designed. The one she controlled," Julian corrected, a final, pathetic spark of defiance in his eyes. "She sabotaged us. She didn't hand over the biometric handshakes. She left a ghost in the machine." Arthur looked down at the report. The mistake wasn't a glitch. It was a masterpiece of corporate architecture. I hadn't stolen a dime. I had simply ensured that the money stayed with the client and that the client realized Sterling Global was no longer a safe harbor. The exit fees alone, the penalties for the failed handshake, had wiped out the firm's operating profit for the next 3 quarters. "She didn't sabotage us, Julian," Arthur said, his voice suddenly very tired. "She simply stopped holding our hands while we walked across a tightrope." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a kingdom realizing its treasury is empty. Arthur flipped to the final page of the report, where the system had logged the final event before shutdown. It wasn't a string of code. It was a simple, time-stamped log entry from my wedding night. User Elena Vance. System disconnect. Status: happy. "The mistake is costly," Arthur whispered into the quiet room. He looked at his son, the man he had chosen over the woman who had built his empire. The smirk Julian had worn at the wedding was gone, replaced by the crushing realization that he had inherited a hollow shell. 30 miles away, at a small coastal cafe, I sat with Mark. My personal phone, the one the firm didn't have the number for, chirped with a news alert. Sterling Global shares plummet as major client exits. I didn't click it. I didn't need to. I took a bite of my croissant, the pastry light and buttery, and looked out at the ocean. The Ice Queen had melted, and in her wake, she'd left a flood that was currently drowning the man who thought he could replace her. "Everything okay?" Mark asked, noting my gaze. "Perfect," I said. "I was just thinking about the weather. It's a beautiful day for a new beginning." But as I reached for my coffee, I saw a familiar black sedan pull into the parking lot. A man in a suit got out, Arthur's personal driver. He was holding a handwritten envelope. The game wasn't over. It was just entering the second act. The driver didn't approach the table. He stood by the sedan, a silent sentinel in a charcoal suit, holding the cream-colored envelope like a white flag. Mark looked at the man, then at me, his brow furrowed. "Is that—" "Sterling's messenger," I said, my voice steady despite the sudden surge of adrenaline. I stood up, the salt breeze catching my hair, and walked toward the car. The envelope was heavy, made of the same expensive vellum as my wedding invitations. No address, just my name, Elena, written in Arthur's precise, archaic cursive. I tore it open. Inside was a single check and a note. The check was for an amount that made the $44 million exit report look like pocket change. It was my full severance, tripled, plus the stock options Julian had claimed were unvested. The note was shorter. The silence is deafening. "The board wants a head on a spike. Julian is gone. Come back and name your price. Or stay away and watch the rest burn. Either way, you win." I looked at the driver. "He fired Julian?" "Effective at 8 a.m. this morning, ma'am," the driver replied, his eyes shielded by sunglasses. "Mr. Sterling is currently at the Henderson offices trying to beg for a meeting. They told him they only take calls from the architect." The irony was a cold, sharp blade. Arthur was willing to sacrifice his own blood to save his gold. He thought he could buy back the soul of the company with a check and a public shaming of his son. He thought I was motivated by the money or the title, failing to realize that once you've felt the freedom of the off switch, the on position holds very little charm. I turned the check over in my fingers. It was enough to build my own firm. It was enough to buy a villa in Tuscany and never look at a candlestick chart again. But more than the money, it was a confession. It was the CEO of a global powerhouse admitting that without the placeholder, he was nothing but a man in an expensive suit sitting in an empty room. "Tell him," I said, handing the note back to the driver but kept the check, "that I'm currently on my honeymoon. And my work phone has been recycled." "And the offer, ma'am?" I looked back at Mark, who was watching me with a mixture of pride and curiosity. I thought about the $44 million mistake, the smirk on Julian's face, and the long, grueling years I had given to a man who didn't know my value until it was gone. "Tell Arthur that the cost of the mistake just went up," I said, a thin, predatory smile finally reaching my eyes. "If he wants to talk, he can find my new consulting firm's website. The hourly rate starts at the price of that sedan." As the driver tipped his hat and slid back into the car, I felt the final piece of the Sterling Empire crumble in my mind. I walked back to the table, sat down, and finished my coffee. The sun was higher now, the day brighter. The report was filed. The client had exited. The boss was broken. "Everything settled?" Mark asked, reaching for my hand. "Everything," I replied. "Now, let's talk about where we're going next. I hear the markets in Singapore are looking for someone who knows how to build something that actually lasts." The mistake was indeed costly, but for me, it was the best investment I had ever made.